They found him in a boat, curled like a king beneath the northern sky. Sword laid across his chest, shield by his side, bronze brooches still clasping a cloak that turned to dust 1,000 years ago. Orkney, 10th century, a Viking, without question, until the DNA spoke. And it didn't whisper. It screamed. This man, this warrior, wasn't Scandinavian, not Danish, not Swedish, not even close. He was Pictish, born of the wild Scottish blood that once resisted the Roman Empire. A local, an outsider. So why was he buried like a son of Odin? Why was he honored in the most sacred ritual of the Norse world? A boat burial reserved for Viking heroes? Because here's the truth no one taught you. Viking was never just a birthright. It was a role, a mask, a myth you could wear, if you knew how to play the part. And this man played it to the end. When his bones were sequenced in 2020 as part of the largest Viking DNA study ever conducted, 442 skeletons across Europe, his identity cracked open a centuries-old illusion. Led by Professor S. Willersleff, the team uncovered graves, just like this one. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Warriors with Viking swords, but Irish blood. Merchants buried in Norse fashion with Slavic genes. Children raised in Viking households who carried no Norse lineage at all. What does that make them? Invaders? Pretenders? Or the truest Vikings of all, because they chose it? The story we tell about Vikings, men of ice, blood, and blonde hair, is about to collapse, because this grave in Orkney wasn't a mistake. It was a message, and it echoed across burial mounds from Dublin to Kiev. This wasn't an outlier. It was a pattern. And the next skeleton? The next Viking? He doesn't just rewrite what you thought about bloodlines. He never should have existed at all, but there he was, sword in hand, Viking in every way, except the one that mattered most, his blood. Because when scientists opened that grave in Orkney, they didn't just uncover a man out of place. They cracked open a question. What if Viking wasn't a people, but a performance? And yet, his bones were right there, laid to rest in the earth, with a Viking blade in one hand, and no Viking blood in his veins. But he wasn't alone, because once the Orkney grave was decoded, the floodgates opened, and what poured out shattered everything we thought we knew. A team of geneticists from the University of Copenhagen, Cambridge, and the UK's Lundbeck Foundation began sequencing hundreds of skeletons buried in Viking sites. Over 400 individuals, 80 archaeological locations, from Greenland to Ukraine. The study, published in Nature, was supposed to confirm what textbooks had preached for centuries, that the Viking world was built by Scandinavian warriors spreading their bloodline like wildfire. But that's not what the DNA showed. Not even close. In northern Scotland, graves marked with Viking ritual, weapons, ornaments, revealed zero trace of Scandinavian ancestry. Zero. In some cases, the genetic matches pointed not north, but south. Southern Europe, Slavic regions, even threads of ancestry from as far as West Asia. These weren't Viking conquerors. They were locals, traders, allies, maybe even former enemies. Yet they were buried in the same way, with the same honors, as Norse-born elites. It wasn't a mistake. It was a transformation, one that ran deeper than raiding or pillaging. To be Viking wasn't about your mother tongue or your grandparents' village. It was about stepping into a world, a myth, a role you could earn or be invited into. And once you were in, your DNA didn't matter. Your sword did. Your loyalty. Your willingness to live and die beneath a banner you weren't born into. But here's the twist. This open identity, this cultural gateway, it didn't start during the Viking-age. It started much, much earlier. Because when scientists traced these genetic markers deeper, they uncovered something hiding inside the Viking genome itself. Something ancient, something foreign. And the question became, how long had Viking blood been blended? Longer than the Viking-age itself. Because when the geneticists looked deeper, beneath the swords, beneath the shields, beneath even the myths, they didn't find purity. They found chaos. Centuries before the first longship kissed the British coast. Before Viking even had a name, Scandinavia was already a crossroads. and its blood told the story. In ancient bones from Denmark and southern Sweden, scientists found something strange, a signature that didn't belong. Not Nordic, not local, foreign, Southern European genes, from people who'd once farmed the sunlit hills of Anatolia. Their ancestors had spread north through Europe during the Neolithic era, 6,000 years ago, bringing agriculture, language, and yes, their DNA. By the Iron Age, their blood had reached Denmark. By the Bronze Age, it was mixing in. And that wasn't all. To the east, from the steppes of modern-day Ukraine and Kazakhstan, another current flowed in. Yamnaya horsemen, Bronze Age warriors whose genes now pulse through nearly every European population. They brought Indo-European languages, and their DNA didn't skip Scandinavia. Then, far to the north, came another whisper, one colder, wilder, the Sami, indigenous people of the Arctic, carrying Siberian threads and Uralic ancestry. And in Viking graves in Sweden, their bloodline quietly appears. By the time the Viking Age began, around 750 CE, the Scandinavian genome was already a patchwork. No one was purely Norse. Not really. Not ever. The Viking Age didn't begin with a single bloodline. It began with a swirl, a quiet storm, centuries in the making. And when they finally launched the ships, when they carved their sails against the wind and set fire to the horizon, that storm didn't stay in the north. It followed them, because what came next wasn't just conquest. It was an explosion. And in one shattered boat burial, found far from home, four brothers would carry that genetic storm into battle and die side by side. They carried the storm in their blood, and when it reached the Baltic shore, it left behind a grave no one was meant to find. Estonia, late 700s. 2 Viking ships buried beneath the soil. 41 men inside, all armed, all cut down, all laid to rest together. But in one of those ships, 4 of them stood out. They weren't warriors thrown together by chance. They were family, brothers, 4 young men, carbon dated to the same moment in time. Their genomes are almost identical. Geneticists in 2020, part of the Nature Viking DNA study, sequenced their remains. What they found was rare, almost impossible. All 4 came from the same valley in central Sweden. Same bloodline, same parents, same village. They left home together. They died together. And someone, maybe kin, maybe comrades, buried them with honor. In rows, in armor, in silence. This was not the typical Viking band. Most Viking burials show something else. Foreigners buried in Norse style. Locals wrapped in Viking gear. Strangers with swords they may have never earned. But the Somme brothers, they were different. This was the old way. A memory of when Viking raids were still family affairs. Tight tribal, built from kinship, not conquest. Before the melting began. Before the identity unraveled into myth. Yet even this moment, this pure echo, stood beside contradiction. Because aboard those same boats, geneticists also found others. Not brothers, not locals, different ancestries, different origins, sharing the same grave, the same fate. Early Viking armies weren't clean lines. They were woven threads, some ancient, some new. Part family, part fantasy. And as the ships grew bigger, as the journeys reached further, this strange dual identity would collide in a single place. A remote island on the edge of the world, where a new Viking homeland would rise. Not through blood, but through bondage. The ships reached land in silence. Iceland, windswept, volcanic, unclaimed. A place beyond kings, beyond empires. The sagas say it was settled by Norse explorers, adventurers, rebels seeking freedom at the edge of the world. But when the DNA was finally sequenced, a different story emerged from the bones. Half of Iceland's founding population were not Norse at all. They were women from the British Isles, Irish, Scottish, Gaelic in blood, voice, and memory. In 2018, a landmark genomic study published in Science analyzed the remains of early Icelandic settlers. What it found was not a Scandinavian colony, but a collision. Norse men had sailed from Norway, but they didn't come alone. They brought women, many taken from raids on Ireland and Scotland. Not migrants, not partners, captives. And yet, some of these women received Viking burials. One was found interred with a sword, a symbol of warrior status, or a grave marker of assimilation. So what does that make her? Was she a slave who earned her freedom? A survivor who became something else? Or was Viking already evolving? From an ethnic label to a cultural title you could claim, even if your ancestors came in chains. Iceland was not born from a single bloodline. It was forged through forced unions, cultural layering, and quiet resistance. According to modern genomic surveys, 63% of Iceland's maternal ancestry traces back to Celtic roots. The women who were once voiceless now echo in every genetic line. A new people rose from that ground. Not Scandinavian, not Gaelic, something else entirely. But the Norse didn't only bring Gaelic captives west. They went east, into forests and riverlands where even their gods would be forgotten. Because across the sea, another Viking world was taking shape, not by fusion, but by full transformation. They fused a nation in the north, through bloodlines that were never meant to mix. But in the east, the transformation cut deeper. There, Viking identity wasn't blended. It was rewritten. Until not even the gods were remembered. They were Swedish by blood, but the rivers changed them. Down the Neva, the Folkhof, the Dnieper, Norsemen sailed not as conquerors, but as something stranger. Foreigners hired to rule. Outsiders invited in. In the year 862, a name appears in the primary chronicle. Rurik, a Scandinavian war leader, called upon by Slavic tribes to bring order. And from his hand, a dynasty was born. Novgorod, then Kiev. From forests and wetlands, the Rus emerged. A kingdom built by Norse bones, but crowned with Slavic breath. At first, the gods came with them. Odin, Thor, Freyr. But they didn't last. By 988, Vladimir the Great, great-grandson of those Norse settlers, stood before the Dnieper River and made a choice. He cast down the old ways, burned the temples, baptized his warriors beneath orthodox rites. With that, the last link broke. The Norse language vanished from palaces. Slavic tongues filled the halls. Their children bore Christian names, worshipped Christian saints, fought Christian wars. But inside their blood, the Viking fire still flickered. Modern Y-DNA analysis shows it. Scandinavian male haplogroups embedded in Eastern European lines. A whisper of Varangian ancestry beneath the Cyrillic alphabet. They had become the Rus. Not by conquest, by forgetting. This wasn't erasure by sword. It was self-removal. They shed their skin and stepped into another. But while their gods drowned in rivers of faith, Viking blood was drifting somewhere else, farther south than myth dared travel, and in a grave by the Baltic Sea. One skull would tell a story no saga ever recorded. One skull, one face buried in the north, with skin once kissed by southern light. They had buried their gods in the east, forgotten their names, erased their myths. But back in the north, something older was already hiding beneath the surface. Not Norse, not even close. In a Danish burial site, dated to the height of the Viking-age, archaeologists recovered remains of a man honored with full Viking rites. Weapons, runes, charcoal, precision. But when his DNA was decoded in the 2020 Nature study, his ancestry lit up the south. A signal from the Mediterranean, Italian, Balkan, maybe even Anatolian. A Viking grave, with Roman blood. It shouldn't have made sense. But it wasn't the only one. Another individual from a different site, buried in Jutland, carried mitochondrial markers linked to southeastern Europe. Further analysis suggested connections to migrants who had entered northern Europe after the fall of Rome. The collapse of the Western Empire in the 5th century had sent its fragments outward. Mercenaries, craftsmen, refugees. They didn't just pass through. Some stayed, some intermarried, and their descendants, centuries later, were wearing Viking swords. The burial goods said one thing. The genome said another. And neither was lying. The Viking world didn't just raid Rome. It absorbed its remnants. This wasn't diffusion. It was sediment, layered into the identity before it even had a name. Scandinavia wasn't a frozen core. It was porous. It pulled in what it touched: southern blood, eastern ideas, western captives. And in some graves you can see the moment it all fused. But that wasn't the only way southern DNA entered the Viking world. Not every outsider came by foot or battle. Some arrived wrapped in silk, traded for silver, or carried across rivers by merchant hands. One of them left behind a ring, etched with Arabic script, on the finger of a woman who spoke not a word of it. A silver ring, etched with Arabic script, found on the finger of a Viking woman, who almost certainly never left Scandinavia. She didn't speak the language carved into the metal. She didn't pray to the god it invoked. But still, she was buried with it, as if it meant something. Something sacred. Her grave was uncovered in Birka, Sweden, one of the most active Viking trade ports of the 9th century. Archaeologists had known about it since the 1800s. But it wasn't until 2015, when researchers at Stockholm University used scanning electron microscopy, that the truth beneath the inscription became clear. The ring didn't just mimic Arabic. It was Arabic. Ayalala. For Allah. It came from the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad's golden age, 1,500 miles away. And it wasn't the only import in that grave. Fragments of Islamic silk, glass traced to the Byzantine world, even coins stamped with Kufic script, used in Muslim lands. So how did it all end up here, beneath the soil of Viking Sweden? Because by the 800s, Viking ships weren't just raiding. They were trading. They pushed down the Dnieper River to the Black Sea. They reached Baghdad through the Caspian Gate. And at every port, they didn't just exchange goods. They exchanged bloodlines. Some converted. Some married. Others returned with gifts, worn by wives who never left the north. This wasn't cultural diffusion. It was intimate, biological, permanent. When you bury a Norse woman with Abbasid silver, you're not just trading objects. You're blending worlds. And if Viking DNA could carry Mediterranean ancestry, if it could hold onto prayers it didn't speak, then what is Viking now? Because the final twist in this genome story isn't in the past. It's inside us. What does Viking DNA mean now? If it once wore Arabic rings, southern blood, and foreign gods, we type in our names, spit in a tube, wait for a portal to open, and when it does, it says something simple: Scandinavian, Norse, Viking. But that label is a ghost, because the DNA inside you might carry the shape of a Viking, but not the origin. According to a massive 2020 genome study published in Nature, most people living in Scandinavia today don't fully match the Viking dead. Modern Swedes, only 15 to 30% overlap with the actual genetic profile of the Viking age. It's not that the Vikings disappeared. It's that they were never a single people to begin with. And when we follow that DNA west, across the North Sea, it gets even more twisted. Roughly 6% of Britons show signs of Viking ancestry. But that Viking ancestor might have had zero Scandinavian roots. He could have been a Gaelic slave, reburied in a Norse grave. She could have been a Baltic woman, captured and brought to Iceland. They may have worshipped Slavic spirits or whispered prayers in Arabic, and still be called Viking. Because Viking was never an ethnicity. It was a transformation, an identity you wore, a code you lived by, a mask you could earn, steal, or be forced to carry. Your DNA doesn't tell you who you are. It tells you who survived long enough for you to ask. We inherit fragments, not memory, not truth, just molecules. But even molecules hold stories, and some of them, once uncovered, have been used for something darker, not to connect, but to conquer, to claim, to divide. Because once DNA became digital, some began using it not to learn, but to prove. In certain corners of the internet, the word Viking doesn't mean explorer, settler, or survivor. It means bloodline. It means purity. It means superiority. In far-right circles, Viking symbols have been twisted into banners. Odin's rune turned into hate tattoos. Runestones copied onto riot shields. They imagine the Norse as a master race. Blonde, blue-eyed, unmixed. But here's the contradiction. And it's not even subtle. Genetic science, archaeological data, cultural records. They all say the same thing. the Viking world was anything but pure. They married Gaelic women, buried Slavs with honor, adopted Christianity in the East, traded with Muslims in the South, and absorbed Mediterranean DNA before the longships even launched. Their graves hold Irish jewelry, Arabic rings, Siberian bone tools. Their genomes are a kaleidoscope. They were not a bloodline. They were a bridge. But myth doesn't care about nuance. And when myth becomes weapon, history gets rewritten to justify identity. And so, some cling to fiction. To be Viking is to be untouched, untainted, chosen. The irony. Every new DNA sequence proves the opposite. They were raiders, yes, but also refugees, also hybrids, also humans, caught in migrations they couldn't control. And if we distort their truth, we risk becoming blind to our own. But there is another way to look at this. A version of Viking history that isn't sterile or filtered, but honest, unfinished, alive. Because the truth, the real truth, is far more human. They weren't chosen, not by blood, not by birth, not by saga. And yet, they are still here, in the silence between legends. Because after the myths collapse, after the purity lies fall apart, you begin to see the real Vikings. Not the ones in armor, but the ones who were never meant to be remembered. A young woman Gaelic enslaved, taken west by raiders. Her name was never recorded. And yet today, her DNA lives in more than half of Iceland. She built a nation, with no monument, no thanks. A boy, Pictish by blood, laid in a Viking ship burial in Orkney. His genome says he was local, but someone gave him Norse weapons, Norse honor, Norse death. Because for every Viking who swung a sword, there was someone who didn't choose the journey. He didn't choose the title, but it chose him. And far to the north, on the tundra's edge, a girl born of the Sami, her people, older than Viking memory. But when she died, they gave her a warrior's grave, a shield, a horse, a legacy. No one wrote her story, but the soil kept it safe. Because Viking was never one thing. It was collision. It was crossing. It was survival. It was not what you were, but what you became, what you endured, what you dared to carry forward. And if a ring can whisper Arabic on Norse soil, if a Roman skull can rest in a Danish tomb, if a slave can become an ancestor, then maybe the Viking age never ended. Maybe it's in us, in every hybrid heartbeat, every name forgotten by history, but not by blood. So if you've ever wondered what hidden code your ancestors passed to you, you're not alone. Because the next story, the one buried inside you, might be the most extraordinary of all. And if that idea stays with you, subscribe. Let's find what your DNA still remembers.